The moment my son-in-law raised his hand at my dinner table, I knew our lives were about to change forever. 14 people were sitting around that table on a quiet Sunday evening, plates still warm, glasses half full. The smell of roasted chicken and garlic drifting through my apartment like it always did on the second Sunday of every month. It was our tradition, the one thing that made me feel like even after losing my husband 20 years ago, our family still had a center. I remember looking at the clock on my stove just seconds before it happened. 6:47 p.m. The red numbers glowing steady and ordinarily, like any other night. I remember because later I would replay that moment so many times I could see every detail as clearly as if it were frozen in glass. My daughter Naomi was sitting to my left, her shoulders slightly hunched, her hands folded too tightly in her lap. Across from her sat Derek, my son-in-law, his jaw clenched, eyes sharp in a way that made the air feel thinner. Next to him, his mother Patricia sat perfectly straight, napkin folded neatly on her lap, watching everything like she was waiting for something to happen. First it was just words. Low, tense, sharp around the edges. Naomi had mentioned she was thinking about going back to work full-time at the pharmacy now that Elijah was older. It should have been a simple conversation. A happy one even. But Derek's fork hit his plate with a hard metallic clink that made everyone look up. "You think that's a good idea?" he said, his voice calm in that way that isn't calm at all. Naomi's voice was soft. "I just think it might help. And I miss it." Patricia sighed loudly, like she'd been inconvenienced. "A mother's place is with her family," she said, not even looking at Naomi directly. I felt Naomi's knee press against mine under the table. A silent signal I hadn't felt since she was a child asking me to help her without saying a word. "We're just talking," I said gently, trying to smooth the air. "There's no reason to." Derek stood up so suddenly that his chair scraped hard against the floor. The sound cut through the room like glass breaking. Conversations stopped. Even the kids at the smaller table went quiet. "I'm tired of this conversation," he said, his voice low and controlled, but his eyes were burning. Naomi stood too, her voice shaking. "Please don't do this here." And then it happened. His hand came out of nowhere, fast and loud, striking her across the face with a crack that echoed off the walls. Naomi stumbled sideways, catching herself on the edge of the table, her hand flying to her cheek as the room fell into a silence so heavy it felt like the air had been sucked out. For 3 seconds nobody moved. Then Patricia slowly brought her hands together and clapped once. The sound was soft, but it might as well have been thunder. "Well," she said coolly, "someone needed to put a stop to the nonsense." My heart didn't race. It didn't pound. It felt like it simply stopped, frozen somewhere between shock and a memory I had spent decades trying to bury. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. 42 years as a nurse had taught me that when chaos erupts, someone has to stay steady. I stood up slowly, walked to the counter and picked up my phone. My fingers didn't shake as I dialed. 911, "What's your emergency?" "My daughter has just been assaulted," I said, my voice calm and clear. "The man who did it is still here." Behind me I heard Derek's voice rise. "Hang up the phone. Right now." I turned and looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time I saw not just an angry man, but a man who believed he had the right to hurt my child. "No," I said quietly. Naomi was standing against the wall now, tears streaming silently down her face, the red mark on her cheek already darkening. Elijah was crying at the smaller table, confused and scared, his little hands covering his ears. "Police are on the way," the operator said. "Stay on the line." I kept my eyes on Derek. "No one is leaving this house," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear. The room shifted then. My nephew stood up slowly, positioning himself between Derek and the door. My sister Lorraine moved to Naomi's side, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. Even Patricia's confident expression flickered for just a second. "You've just made a big mistake," Derek said, his voice dropping into something colder. "Maybe," I replied, "but not as big as yours." The minutes that followed felt stretched and unreal, like time had slowed down just enough for every breath to feel deliberate. No one touched their food. No one spoke above a whisper. Naomi leaned into Lorraine, her body trembling, while Elijah clung to her waist. I stayed on the phone, giving details, describing what happened, watching Derek pace like a caged animal in the middle of my living room. When the knock finally came, sharp and authoritative, a wave of relief washed through me so strong my knees almost gave out. 2 officers stepped inside, their presence instantly changing the atmosphere. The female officer looked directly at Naomi, her eyes softening as she saw the bruise forming on her face. "Ma'am, did someone hit you?" she asked gently. Naomi hesitated, glancing at Derek, fear flashing across her eyes. I stepped forward. "Yes," I said firmly. "He did." The officer nodded, her expression hardening as she turned toward Derek. Within minutes, questions were being asked, statements taken. The room buzzing with a controlled urgency that felt both terrifying and comforting at the same time. Naomi finally whispered, "He hit me." Her voice barely audible but strong enough to change everything. As they led Derek toward the door, he turned back, his eyes locking onto Naomi with a look that made my stomach drop. "This isn't over," he said quietly. The door closed behind him with a heavy finality, and for the first time since it happened, Naomi collapsed into my arms, sobbing so hard I could feel the years of pain behind every breath. "I'm so sorry, Mom," she cried. I held her tighter, my own tears finally falling as I whispered the only words that mattered. "You have nothing to be sorry for. I've got you." But as I looked around at the shocked faces in my living room, at the half-eaten plates and overturned chairs, I felt a deep, sinking realization settle in my chest. This wasn't just one terrible moment. This was the beginning of something much bigger. And later that night, as Naomi sat quietly on my couch holding an ice pack to her cheek, she looked at me with eyes full of fear and said the words that told me just how deep this nightmare really went. "Mom, this isn't the first time. Mom, this isn't the first time." Her words didn't just hang in the air. They settled into my chest like something heavy and cold, pressing against my lungs until breathing felt like work. For a moment I couldn't speak. I just looked at her, really looked at her, searching her face for the daughter I thought I knew and realizing there were whole chapters of her life I had never seen. Naomi sat curled into the corner of my couch, an ice pack pressed gently against her cheek, her shoulders drawn inward like she was trying to make herself smaller. Elijah had finally fallen asleep beside her, his small hand still gripping the sleeve of her sweater even in his dreams, like he was afraid she might disappear if he let go. "How long?" I asked quietly, afraid of the answer but needing to hear it. She stared down at her hands. "A few years," she whispered. "It started small, just yelling, then grabbing, then more." The room felt too quiet, the ticking of the wall clock suddenly loud and intrusive. I sat down beside her slowly, my mind racing back through every family gathering, every holiday, every phone call where she said she was fine. "Why didn't you tell me?" My voice cracked despite my effort to stay calm. Tears slid down her face again. "Because I kept thinking it would stop. And I was embarrassed. And he always said no one would believe me." A sharp pain spread through my chest, a mix of anger and guilt so strong it made my hands tremble. I reached for hers, holding them tightly. "I believe you," I said firmly. "I always will." That night, Naomi and Elijah stayed with me. I made up the guest room with fresh sheets even though it was nearly midnight, moving through the motions because doing something, anything, felt better than sitting still with the storm of thoughts inside my head. Around 2 in the morning, I found Naomi standing in the kitchen, wrapped in one of my old robes, staring out the window into the darkness. "Can't sleep?" I asked softly. She shook her head. "Every time I close my eyes, I hear it again." I understood that feeling more than I wanted to admit. Memories have a way of replaying themselves when the world gets quiet. "You're safe here," I told her. She nodded, but I could see she didn't fully believe it yet. The next morning, the reality of what had happened settled in like a heavy fog. My phone rang constantly. Family members checking in, asking questions, offering opinions. Lorraine came by with groceries. Thomas stopped in to fix the loose lock on my front door without even being asked. But beneath all the support, there was an undercurrent of fear that none of us said out loud. Derek had been released that afternoon. When the detective called to inform me, I felt my stomach drop. "He made bail," she explained gently. "There's a temporary protective order in place, but I want you to stay alert." After I hung up, I stood in my kitchen gripping the counter, staring at nothing. "He's out, isn't he?" Naomi said quietly from the doorway. I nodded. Her face went pale, and for a moment I thought she might collapse. He can't come near you, I said quickly. There's an order. She let out a shaky breath. Orders don't always stop people. Her words carried a weight of experience I wished she didn't have. Over the next few days, the emotional toll became impossible to ignore. Naomi barely ate. She startled at sudden noises. Elijah began having nightmares, crying out for his mother in the middle of the night. I spent my days making phone calls, therapists, lawyers, victim support services, navigating a world I never thought we would have to enter. Each conversation felt surreal, like I had stepped into someone else's life. The legal process began moving forward slowly and complicatedly. Naomi had to give a formal statement. We sat together in a small office at the police station, her hand gripping mine as she recounted what had happened, her voice trembling but steady enough to be heard. Afterward, she looked exhausted, like she had just run a marathon she never trained for. You did so well, I told her as we walked to the car. I feel like I'm falling apart, she admitted. You're not, I said gently. You're healing. But the hardest moment came a week later at the preliminary hearing. The courtroom was colder than I expected, the air thick with tension. Derek sat at the defense table in a suit, looking calm and composed, like he was attending a business meeting instead of facing consequences for what he'd done. He glanced at Naomi once, his expression unreadable, and I felt her hand tighten around mine. The judge listened to both sides, reviewed the evidence, and then ruled that Derek would remain free until trial under certain conditions. As we walked out of the courthouse, Naomi's shoulders slumped. It feels like nothing changed, she whispered. It will, I said, though I wasn't entirely sure how. That night, as we sat in my living room, Naomi spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. There's something else, she said. I think Derek is hiding things. Financial things. I've seen documents that didn't make sense. I looked at her, a new concern rising. What kind of things? Large payments. Cash deposits. He always told me not to ask questions. A chill ran down my spine. The situation suddenly felt bigger, darker, more complicated than I had realized. The next day, I called the detective and shared what Naomi had told me. Her response was immediate and serious. I'd like to look into that, she said. There may be more going on here. When I hung up, I realized this nightmare wasn't just about what happened at my dinner table. It was unfolding into something deeper. That evening, as Naomi tucked Elijah into bed, I stood in the hallway watching them, my heart aching at the sight of my daughter trying so hard to be strong for her child. Later, we sat together on the couch in the quiet glow of the lamp. Are you scared? I asked. She nodded. But I also feel relieved. Like maybe it's finally ending. I wrapped an arm around her shoulders. It is, I said softly. Whatever it takes, we're going to get through this. But as I turned off the lights that night and lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were only seeing the surface of something much larger. And the next morning, when the detective called asking to meet because she had found something concerning in Derek's background, I knew our lives were about to change again, in ways I never could have imagined. When the detective said she had found something concerning, I felt that familiar tightening in my chest, the kind that tells you life is about to shift again, whether you're ready or not. We met her the next afternoon in a small conference room inside the police department. The walls were plain, the lighting too bright, the kind of place where truth tends to surface whether you want it to or not. Naomi sat beside me, her hands folded tightly in her lap, her eyes tired but determined. The detective closed the door gently behind us and sat across from us, a thin folder resting on the table. I'm going to be honest, she said. Some things came up when we looked into Derek's background. Financial irregularities. Patterns that don't look right. Naomi inhaled slowly, like she had expected this but still dreaded hearing it out loud. What kind of patterns? I asked. Large cash deposits. Contracts that don't match reported income. Possible fraud, she replied. We're still investigating, but it suggests he may be involved in something bigger than we initially thought. The words hung in the air, heavy and unsettling. Naomi looked down. I knew something was off, she said quietly. I just didn't know what. On the drive home, neither of us spoke much. The city moved around us like normal, traffic lights changing, people walking, life continuing. While inside the car, everything felt suspended in uncertainty. That evening, Naomi sat at my kitchen table staring at a mug of tea gone cold. "There's something I never told you," she said suddenly. I sat across from her, my heart already bracing. "What is it?" "I started saving things," she said. "Documents. Photos." I didn't know why at first. I just felt like I needed proof in case things got worse. My breath caught. "You kept evidence?" She nodded slowly. "I have a phone he didn't know about. I recorded arguments sometimes. And I photographed paperwork when he wasn't home." A mix of pride and heartbreak washed over me. My daughter had been living in survival mode, quietly preparing for a moment she hoped would never come. "Do you still have it?" I asked gently. She stood and walked to the guest room, returning a minute later holding an older phone with a cracked case. She placed it on the table like it was something fragile and dangerous at the same time. "I haven't looked at it in months," she admitted. I couldn't. I reached over and squeezed her hand. "We'll look together." We spent the next hour going through files, photos of invoices, screenshots of bank transfers, audio recordings labeled only with dates. With each piece of evidence, the picture became clearer and more disturbing. There were recordings of Derek's voice raised in anger, moments of intimidation, threats whispered in cold tones that made my stomach turn. At one point, Naomi pressed pause, tears streaming silently down her face. "I kept thinking if I just stayed quiet things wouldn't get worse," she whispered. "You did what you had to do to survive," I said softly. The next morning we brought everything to the detective. She listened carefully, her expression growing more serious with each file. "This is significant," she said finally. "Very significant." Days passed in a strange mixture of waiting and tension. Naomi started therapy, slowly unpacking years of fear and silence. Elijah began seeing a child counselor, drawing pictures filled with dark clouds and small figures holding hands under a bright sun. One evening, as we sat watching television, Naomi's phone buzzed. She froze instantly, her face draining of color. "It's him," she whispered. A message flashed on the screen. "We need to talk." My heart pounded. "Don't respond," I said immediately. She nodded, her fingers trembling as she set the phone down, as it might burn her. Over the next week, more messages came, some apologetic, some angry, some pleading. Each one felt like a reminder that the storm wasn't over yet. The detective advised us to document everything. "It helps build the case," she explained. But the real turning point came late one night. We were asleep when a loud noise jolted me awake, a sharp thud from downstairs. My heart raced as I listened, every nerve alert. Another sound. Footsteps outside the door. I grabbed my phone and checked the security camera feed Thomas had installed the week before. Derek stood outside the building entrance, pacing, his movements erratic. My chest tightened. I woke Naomi immediately. "He's here." Fear flashed across her face, but she nodded, taking a steady breath. I called the police, my voice calm despite the adrenaline surging through me. Within minutes, flashing lights illuminated the street below, and officers escorted him away. After the door closed and the sirens faded, Naomi collapsed onto the couch, shaking. "I thought he was going to hurt us," she whispered. I sat beside her, wrapping my arms around her shoulders. "You're safe," I said softly. "He can't hurt you anymore." But even as I said the words, I knew safety wasn't just about distance. It was about justice, about truth coming fully into the light. The following week, the detective called again. "We're moving forward with additional charges," she said. "Based on the evidence Naomi provided and the financial investigation, this case is expanding." Naomi looked at me after I hung up, a mixture of fear and relief in her eyes. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now," I said gently, "the truth comes out." That night, as I watched my daughter sleeping peacefully for the first time in weeks, I realized how much strength it had taken for her to survive all those years. But I also knew the hardest part was still ahead. Because when secrets finally come into the light, they don't just disappear. They demand to be faced. And soon we would all have to face just how deep this story really went. By the time the case officially moved forward, it felt like we had been holding our breath for weeks. The morning of the first major hearing arrived gray and cold, the kind of morning where the sky looks heavy enough to fall. Naomi stood in my hallway adjusting the sleeves of her blazer, her movements slow and deliberate like she was preparing for battle. Elijah hugged her tightly before leaving for school with Lorraine, his small arms wrapped around her waist longer than usual. "You're going to be okay, Mommy," he said with a seriousness no child should have to carry. Naomi smiled softly, brushing his hair back. "I know, baby." But once the door closed behind him, her smile faded, replaced by a quiet determination. The courthouse felt intimidating the moment we stepped inside. Tall ceilings, polished floors, the low hum of voices echoing through wide hallways. Derek sat across the room at a table with his attorney, looking calm, almost bored, like this was just another inconvenience in his day. But when his eyes landed on Naomi, something darker flickered there, something that made my protective instincts surge. The hearing began with formalities, legal language filling the room, but the real weight came when the prosecutor began presenting evidence. Photos, records, the messages he had sent, the reports from the night he showed up outside my building. Naomi testified with a quiet strength that made my chest swell with pride and ache at the same time. Her voice trembled at first, but as she continued, it grew steadier, clearer, like she was finally reclaiming her own story. When the recordings were mentioned, Derek's composure cracked just slightly, a tightening of his jaw, a flicker of anger crossing his face. His attorney tried to argue, to downplay, to reframe events as misunderstandings, but the facts spoke louder than any excuse. By the time the hearing ended, additional charges were officially filed, and the judge reinforced the protective order with stricter conditions. Derek would remain under close supervision, while the investigation continued. Outside the courthouse, Naomi exhaled slowly, like she had been holding that breath all morning. "That was harder than I thought," she admitted. "You did incredible," I said, squeezing her hand. But the real storm came weeks later, when the case expanded further. The detective called late one afternoon, her voice serious. "The financial investigation is moving forward. Federal authorities are getting involved." The words sent a chill through me. This was no longer just about what happened in my dining room. It had become something much bigger. As preparations for trial began, our lives fell into a strange routine of meetings, paperwork, therapy sessions, and waiting. Naomi had good days and bad ones. Some mornings she woke up hopeful, talking about plans for the future. Other days she struggled just to get out of bed. Through it all, I stayed steady, reminding her again and again that she wasn't alone. The trial itself began months later, in a courtroom that felt even colder than the first. The atmosphere was tense, every seat filled, the air thick with anticipation. Derek looked thinner now, his confidence worn down, but his eyes still held that stubborn defiance. Witnesses testified one by one, officers, investigators, financial experts, each piece of testimony adding another layer to the truth that was unfolding. When Naomi took the stand, the room fell completely silent. She spoke about the years of fear, the moments she had stayed quiet, the strength it took to finally speak up. There were tears in the room, including my own, but she never lost her composure. At one point, the prosecutor played a short portion of an audio recording. Derek's voice filled the courtroom, angry and threatening, and I watched the jury's expression shift as the reality became undeniable. The defense tried to challenge the evidence, tried to create doubt, but the weight of the truth was too heavy to ignore. Days turned into weeks as the trial continued, each session emotionally exhausting but necessary. Then came the closing arguments. The prosecutor spoke about courage, about breaking cycles of silence, about the importance of accountability. The defense argued for leniency, painting Derek as flawed but not malicious. When the jury left to deliberate, the waiting felt unbearable. Naomi and I sat side by side, holding hands, the seconds stretching into hours. Every sound made us look up, every movement raising our hopes and fears at the same time. Finally, the jury returned. The room held its breath as the verdict was read. Guilty. The word echoed through the courtroom, heavy with finality. Naomi's grip tightened around my hand, tears spilling down her cheeks, but this time they were tears of relief. Derek showed little reaction, but the tension in his shoulders told the real story. Afterward, as we stepped outside into the sunlight, Naomi leaned into me, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's finally real," she said. "Yes," I replied softly. "It is." But even with the verdict delivered, one step remained: sentencing. Weeks later, we returned to the courthouse once more. The judge spoke about accountability, about the impact of actions, about the courage it took for victims to come forward. When the sentence was announced, a weight I hadn't realized I was carrying finally lifted. Derek would face real consequences and time to reflect on the harm he had caused. Naomi closed her eyes, tears slipping down her face as she exhaled slowly, like she was releasing years of tension in a single breath. Outside, the air felt lighter, the sky brighter than it had in a long time. As we walked to the car, Naomi looked at me with a small, genuine smile, the first I had seen in what felt like forever. "We did it," she said. "No," I replied gently. "You did it." That night, as we sat quietly in the living room, the house finally felt peaceful again. But I knew the story wasn't just about what we had survived. It was about what came next, learning to live without fear, rebuilding the pieces that had been broken, and finding a way forward. And for the first time since that night at my dinner table, I truly believed we could. The first morning after everything was finally over felt strangely quiet. For months, our lives had been measured by court dates, phone calls, and the constant undercurrent of tension that never fully left our bodies. But that morning, when sunlight filtered softly through the kitchen curtains, the air felt different, lighter somehow, like the world had taken a deep breath and was finally exhaling. Naomi sat at the table with a cup of coffee, her hair pulled back loosely, her shoulders relaxed in a way I hadn't seen in years. Elijah was telling her about a dream he had, something about flying over a playground, his voice animated and carefree. I stood by the counter watching them, feeling something warm spread through my chest. It wasn't just relief, it was peace. For the first time since that night, our home felt like a place of safety instead of recovery. Life didn't magically become perfect overnight. Healing doesn't work like that. Some days, Naomi still woke up from bad dreams, her breathing shallow, her eyes searching the room until she remembered where she was. Some days, Elijah asked questions no child should have to ask, trying to understand why things had been the way they were. But slowly, steadily, the good days started to outnumber the hard ones. Naomi began taking longer walks in the evenings, sometimes alone, sometimes with me. At first, she stayed close to home, her eyes scanning her surroundings out of habit. But week by week, I saw her confidence returning, like watching a flower slowly open after a long winter. One afternoon, she came home from therapy with a small smile on her face. "My therapist says I'm learning to feel safe again," she said quietly, like she was testing how the words sounded out loud. I reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "I can see it." Elijah started laughing more too. The kind of loud, unfiltered laughter that fills a room and makes everyone else smile without even trying. His nightmares became less frequent, replaced by stories about school and new friends. The house slowly filled with normal sounds again. Music playing softly from Naomi's phone while she cooked, Elijah's cartoons in the morning, the gentle hum of everyday life continuing. A few months later, Naomi decided she was ready to move into her own place. It wasn't far, just a short drive away, but it was a big step, a symbol of independence and strength. The day we helped her unpack, sunlight streamed through the windows of her new apartment, illuminating empty rooms that felt full of possibility. Elijah ran from room to room, deciding where everything should go, his excitement contagious. Naomi stood in the doorway of her bedroom, looking around quietly. "It feels like a fresh start," she said. "It is," I replied softly. We hugged for a long moment, and I felt a deep sense of pride mixed with the bittersweet realization that she was stepping fully into a new chapter of her life. Our Sunday dinners returned too. Smaller now, simpler, but filled with laughter and warmth. The first time we all gathered again, I noticed how different the energy felt. Conversations flowed easily, and there was a lightness that had been missing before. At one point, Naomi looked around the table, her eyes shining. "I forgot what it felt like to just be happy," she said. I reached for her hand. "You deserve this." As the months passed, Naomi began talking about her future again. Career plans, trips she wanted to take, goals she had put on hold for too long. Each conversation felt like another step forward, another piece of herself reclaimed. One evening, as we sat on my balcony watching the sun dip below the horizon, Naomi leaned her head on my shoulder. "Thank you," she said softly. "For what?" "For not giving up on me. For making that call." I wrapped my arm around her. "I would do it again 1,000 times." She smiled, and in that moment, I saw not just my daughter, but a woman who had survived something unimaginable and come out stronger. Life settled into a rhythm we hadn't known was possible again. Ordinary days filled with small joys, quiet moments, and the comforting predictability of routine. I started volunteering at a local support center, wanting to help others the way we had been helped. Listening to other women share their stories reminded me of how powerful it is when someone finally feels heard. One afternoon, a young woman thanked me after a conversation, her eyes filled with gratitude. "You helped me feel less alone," she said. Driving home that day, I realized something important. What we had gone through hadn't just changed our lives. It had given us a deeper understanding of resilience, compassion, and the strength that comes from standing up for what's right. On the anniversary of that night, Naomi and I sat together at the kitchen table, the same place where our lives had once felt like they were falling apart. "I used to think that night destroyed everything," she said quietly, "but now I think it saved me." I nodded, understanding exactly what she meant. Sometimes the hardest moments become turning points, the places where everything begins to shift toward something better. Later that evening, as I washed the dishes and listened to Elijah laughing in the living room, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Not for what happened, but for what we had learned, for the strength we discovered, for the chance to rebuild. Before going to bed, I stood by the window looking out at the quiet street, thinking about how far we had come. One moment, one decision had changed everything. It taught me that courage doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it's as simple as refusing to stay silent. Sometimes it's picking up a phone when your heart is breaking, and your hands are steady because they have to be. I turned off the lights and walked down the hallway, pausing briefly at the photo of Naomi and Elijah smiling together, their faces bright with happiness. Our story wasn't defined by what we endured, but by what we chose afterward: healing, love, and the determination to keep moving forward. And as I lay down that night, the house peaceful around me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a very long time: complete calm. Because the truth is, the greatest victory wasn't the courtroom or the verdict or even the justice that followed. It was watching my daughter laugh again. It was seeing my grandson grow without fear. It was knowing that even after the darkest night, morning still comes. And sometimes all it takes to start that new morning is one call.